Hi everyone. I wanted to follow up on my last video about transitive college football rankings. Since the conclusion of the season, I've had lots of time to look over the results, analyze how the rankings look in practice, and come up with some new ideas. Here are the pre-playoff transitive rankings. I have the percent favorable matchups labeled for each team, which represents what percentage of FBS opponents they would be favored against. And I have decided to exclude all FCS opponents from that calculation, which is a change from the last video. And I've also put each team's placement relative to the actual final CFP ranking. Now, I did talk last time about why I think undefeated teams should always be at the top of the rankings, and I do stand by that. But that being said, this system is meant for a 12-team playoff, so keep that in mind. You may think that teams would want to abuse the advantage of being undefeated by keeping very easy schedules, but I would say it's very implausible from a logistical and predictive standpoint, and it's very risky since it's so common to get upset at least once, which would put them in a far worse place than if they had a difficult schedule with multiple losses. But there are a couple of quirks in this list, so I'm going to take a minute to try and explain them. First, you can see that LSU is ranked just ahead of Alabama, despite having lost to them and having a worse record than them. It is very close, and the overall quality of their wins and losses is similar at first glance, but what really sinks Alabama here is their proximity to losing to Oklahoma. Texas beat Alabama, and Oklahoma beat Texas. LSU does suffer from it too, but being 1 degree further away means it suffers less. Oklahoma is actually considered a measurably worse team than the teams above it, as you can see from the gap between it and Alabama. This also explains why Ole Miss is ranked ahead of Alabama despite losing to them. Texas avoids being below Alabama, though, due to its wins over teams that are favored against Alabama, like Kansas and Oklahoma State. It's sad to see that one respectable loss can tank a team so badly, but you can see there's no favoritism with that. James Madison's singular loss almost left them outside the top 25. But that's because these rankings are much more about strength of schedule than pure record. Let's take a look at the postseason rankings to show what I mean. And here they are. I have their comparison to the final AP poll labeled as well. This top 12 wouldn't necessarily be the exact order. The original format of the 12-team playoff, I think, would have the top 4 ranked conference champs getting a bye, which would be good to add stakes to the conference championships, but you'd still need these rankings for determining the relative order of those teams. I want to note that now Alabama is above LSU. You may wonder why they flipped, since Alabama lost their bowl game and LSU won theirs, and I think it's a great example of how many complicated forces are acting on these teams from week to week, but they're easily understood on closer inspection. Alabama's win over Ole Miss looks better now after Ole Miss had an impressive bowl win over Penn State, which helps Alabama edge LSU. However, Texas and Alabama are still unable to jump Ole Miss, mostly still due to their proximity to Oklahoma, who looks considerably worse after a bowl loss to Arizona. If you look further down the list, you'll see both Kentucky and Rutgers, who both went 7-6. It might seem ridiculous, but if you take a moment to look at their respective schedules, well, they really had some tough opponents. And they didn't have way more awful losses than the teams around them. But if you're still annoyed at the disregard for win-loss records, stay tuned, because we're going to try and make a fix for that later in this video. You might never guess where Colorado ended up after going 4-8. Anyway, one interesting observation is that Clemson and Kentucky didn't move spots at all, even after Clemson beat Kentucky in their bowl game. Now, it might seem absurd to have the head-to-head winner right below the loser, but there's actually a lot of opposing change happening here. The bowl season as a whole wasn't very kind to Clemson and made a lot of the teams they beat and a lot of the teams they lost to look worse. It didn't hurt Kentucky nearly as much. If you removed just the game between these two, Clemson would be ranked maybe 5 spots lower, but Clemson's bowl win was just enough to offset that. The emergence of Iowa into the rankings might seem strange, especially considering their absence before and their less than stellar bowl performance. But that loss was largely considered immaterial since it was against a pretty good team, already favored against Iowa anyway. The bowl games of their opponents also helped them greatly, as well as many of the teams in front of them suffering bad bowl losses, leaving room for them to jump in. You can also see that Arizona is probably rated much higher in the AP poll due to recency bias, which I talked about in the last video. They started the season 3-3 before winning their final 7 games. Overall, I'm pretty satisfied with these rankings. I'm going to show them applied retroactively to the 2 seasons prior, and if you're curious, pause the video and have a peek. One of the questions that you may ask is, do bowl games really matter? I've included them just as any other game, and I'll try and justify it to you. You might doubt their legitimacy since many teams are missing players who have opted out, often wanting to prepare for the NFL draft. I don't think it's fair to discredit your opponent's wins during the season due to your own team's injuries, and likewise for opt-outs in bowl games. It's a chance for a team to showcase its depth. Now, not all opt-out situations are built the same. More talented teams often lose more players, but I would argue that they're ultimately left with more because departing players on less talented teams are often more crucial to that team's success, and there's a much sharper drop-off in talent when those players leave. Also, teams that can retain their seniors for one more game are indicative of a great program, and I think that shouldn't be ignored. My official opinion on the matter has slowly become this. Opt-outs don't affect the outcome of a bowl game, but they do affect the margin. And since we don't care about margin, we just count them as any other game. Obviously, any little thing, down to what the coach ate for breakfast, could theoretically affect the outcome of the game, but I just want to stay away from what ifs. If we look at the Orange Bowl this year between Georgia and Florida State, where Georgia won by 60 points, I think we can see a very unusual example. If I had to say, there were two competing philosophies by two teams that were both convinced they should have made the playoff. Georgia had just suffered its first loss since winning back-to-back national titles, and many players felt there was still something left to prove and didn't want to end on such a sour note. On the other hand, Florida State, with its 19-game win streak, felt it had already proven everything. But if all the games they played before didn't matter, why would this one? Now, do I think Georgia could have beaten Florida State at full strength? Well, anything is possible, but I'm just going off what really happened. I think the whole situation is a result of unclear playoff criteria mixed with the difficult situation of the 4-team format. One other reason you might be hesitant to count bowl games is that they're often not exactly held at neutral sites. Since they are during the colder months, they're often held in places that are essentially home games for teams from the Southwest, Texas, the entire SEC. This is unfortunate, but it's difficult to account for advantages like that, and we already don't consider home advantage in general for the same reason. I may explore that in a later video, but there's really not enough games to have the privilege of mitigating home wins or road losses. So, long story short, we're counting all bowl games. So, one of the topics I often see in college football discourse is which conference is the best? I want to apply these rankings to be able to objectively answer that question. Now, I want to stress that it's really just for fun and that generalized conference rankings should not be used to justify a team's placement, especially since we already have the more granular rankings per team. To define what the best conference is, we want to aggregate the performance of all the conference's teams against out-of-conference opponents. And we don't want to look at just the best team, the worst team, the top half, or the bottom half. Having a team win the national championship may help the conference's case, but it's by no means a guarantee of the conference as a whole being the best. You may be familiar with the idea of a conference challenge in college basketball. It's where each team in one conference plays a team from another conference over the course of a week or so. Notable examples include the Big 12 Big East Battle and the ACC Big 10 Challenge. I think these are cool, but they're not very good for determining which conference is better. First of all, the size of the conferences don't always line up, which allows the bigger one to sit out their worst teams. Second of all, since the team only plays one game, it's easy to stack the matchups in a favorable way for one or the other. If we look at the ACC and SEC this year, these two played far more games with each other than most pairings would since they have many annual rivalries, and that number was still just 13. The ACC won 7 to the SEC's 6, but many of the games were bad samples because they ended up being a top team in one conference beating a bottom team in the other, which doesn't give a lot of information about their relative strength. Ideally, in a conference challenge, every team in one conference would play every team in the other conference. That would prevent any one team from carrying or bombing the whole conference. Luckily, we already have a system where every team has a favorable or unfavorable matchup against almost every other team. There are a few ties, but they're pretty rare and we'll just ignore them. So in a conference challenge for us, we will use these to determine the outcomes of the hypothetical games, and whichever conference has more wins at the end will win the challenge. We're going to have every FBS conference challenge every other FBS conference, and the way we're going to rank the conferences is by the following two criteria. 1. The win-loss record of conference challenges, and 2. In the event of a tie, the overall game-winning percentage. And fret not, Notre Dame. We will put all the independents in their own little conference so that they can participate as well. That being said, here are the final standings. In 11th place, we have the American. In 10th place, we have Conference USA. In 9th place, we have the Mid-American. In 8th place, we have the Independents. In 7th place, we have the Mountain West. In 6th place, we have the Sun Belt. Now, I just wanted to mention that you can see that the top 5 conferences are the Power 5 conferences. And I think that's what most people would expect, but it's nice to see it's supported by the numbers. In fact, no Power 5 conference lost any conference challenge to any non-Power 5 conference, and there's a big gap in win percentage. In 5th place, we have the ACC. In 4th place, we have the Big 12. In 3rd place, we have the Big 10. In 2nd place, we have the SEC. And as I'm sure you guessed, in 1st place, we have the Pac-12. Isn't it just romantic that in the final season of the Pac-12's existence, they ended up being the overall best conference? And if you're curious about the best conference in the prior few seasons, 2022, it was the SEC, and the 2 years before that were dominated by the Big 12. Earlier in the video, we talked a little bit about some strange cases where teams with somewhat underwhelming records would be ranked higher than I think most people would put them. This goes with the transitive philosophy that the strength of your wins and losses matters much more than how many you have, but I want to introduce a new idea with a hypothetical situation. Suppose that we're in a 12-team playoff format, and we have 11 clear-cut playoff teams. They all have great wins, and they're either undefeated or have one loss to another team in the top 11. What we want to decide is who's going to get the final playoff spot. We have Team A, who is 1-11. Their 11 losses are to the top 11 teams, and their one win is against Team B, who is the other team we're thinking about making the playoff. Team B hasn't played any of the top 11 teams, but they do have great wins, and Team A is their only loss. So, who makes the playoff? If you said Team A, which you probably didn't, it's actually not the most ridiculous thing in the world. They had essentially the most difficult schedule possible, and they would be ranked above the team they beat and below the teams they lost to, and Team B didn't even have to face any of those teams. If you believe in a strict ordering of teams, it does make a little bit of sense. If you had the ability to schedule a full FBS round robin, almost every team would have more than 11 losses, and Team A's performance seems to imply that they were unlucky enough to play against every team that would beat them in a round robin. The current system I'm using would say Team A. If you said Team B, which you probably did, that makes sense too. I mean, Team A has one win. They would need five more to even be bowl eligible under most circumstances. You could also say that Team B shouldn't make it either for losing to a 1 and 11 team, or that this situation is somewhat contrived and astronomically unlikely, which is true, but it does kind of happen to a lesser extent already with our current system. What we want is to give a little more value to simply getting wins. That will make us sacrifice some of our faith in the transitive property, though. I think it can all be laid out on a spectrum between what we have now and a system where the team's rank is only based on their winning percentage. I think everyone has their own position on this spectrum with what they think is important, especially if it helps the teams they like. Following their first loss of the season to Alabama in the conference championship, Georgia's head coach, Kirby Smart, said the following about their playoff prospects. Watch the game. It's not the most deserving teams, it's the best four teams. So if you're going to tell me somebody sitting in that committee room and doesn't think that that Georgia team is not one of the best four teams, I don't know if they're in the right profession. I don't really blame him specifically. I think as the head coach, he should advocate for his team. But initially, I actually didn't really like what the discourse of best versus most deserving meant because it deals so much in hypotheticals. Well, if we played so and so, we'd obviously win. Just, look at us. It can't really be refuted because it was never a real argument. Teams might as well just suit up, wave to the fans, and go back into the locker room without playing if they're just meant to be pretty. That'd certainly prevent a lot of injuries. But I think if we look at the actual results of real games, I think we can apply those labels to each end of this spectrum. I think you'd find that most people want some mixture of both. Strangely enough, Georgia benefits much more from a more deserving philosophy than a best one. So, to represent our certainty in the transitive property, we will have a variable x, which ranges between 0 and 1. Our goal with this variable is to have matchups matter less the further away they are from the team. Here's an example to show how this works. Suppose we're looking at Team A. Before, our x value would have been 1, and Team A would have 5 favorable matchups, since you can follow the arrows to the 5 other teams. But now, if we have an x value of 0.5, then we have to consider the distance between Team A and each other team. Team A gets 2 direct wins over B and E. Their win over C is 1 degree further away, so we multiply by 0.5 and add that to the 2 to get 2.5. And Team A actually has 2 paths to Team D, but we won't double count it. We just count the shortest path once, so another 0.5 makes 3. F is 1 degree further away than D is, so we multiply again and get 0.25 for F, for a total of 3.25. What this does is it makes the team's more direct games much more meaningful, and it also allows us to change something else that was rather bothersome. I talked in the last video about how when there's a transitive circle, also known as a circle of suck, any given team will get favorable matchups for teams they're closer to beating, and unfavorable matchups for teams they're closer to losing to. We couldn't give them both a favorable and an unfavorable matchup against every other team in the circle because almost every team will end up being in many convoluted circles of different sizes. But now we can give them decimal amounts of both, which will naturally mean that they will be gradually more favored against teams they are closer to beating and vice versa. Here's an example. If we use the value 0.5, A is a degree removed from directly beating C, so they get 1 times 0.5 favorable matchups against C, and C is 2 degrees removed from beating A, so they get 1 times 0.5 times 0.5 equal to 0.25 favorable matchups against A. Now, we have been ranking based on the percentage of total matchups that are favorable, but I think it may be suitable to instead subtract the unfavorable matchups from the favorable matchups, a number that I will henceforth just call playoff points, or PP. Now, we didn't do that before because the total matchup number would be pretty much the same across all teams by the end of the season, so it wouldn't make much difference. But with this new variable, the total matchup count can vary extremely based on the schedule of the team. Also, when subtracting, a good win can more easily offset a bad loss, whereas before, one bad loss could easily ruin a top team beyond reason. We want to encourage teams to get good wins and not just avoid bad losses. The one caveat to that is that it means that undefeated teams won't automatically be at the top of the rankings anymore, but you guys know how much I love my undefeated teams, so I'm going to sort first by undefeated status and then by playoff points. One interesting effect of subtraction is the impact on teams with low certainty. Certainty is a metric I haven't talked much about, but the total number of matchups a team has effectively describes how much information their games give us. The values are mostly equal when x is close to 0 or 1, but at x equals 0.5, they can differ substantially. The most extreme example of low certainty is Liberty. They enjoy being boosted for being undefeated, but once they suffer their bull loss against Oregon, where they end up depends on whether we want to divide or subtract. Liberty has low certainty because they don't really have any good wins or bad losses. I talked last time about how ranked wins isn't really a great statistic, and Liberty is one example of that. These aren't just unranked wins, they're impressively underwhelming. They don't give us much information because there are so many teams expected to beat all of the opponents that they beat. Their lone loss isn't very informative either, since Oregon would beat almost any other team, too. So Liberty could go almost anywhere in the rankings and be both above the teams they beat and below the team they lost to. With a really low X value, they benefit a lot from their 13-1 record, but with X equal to 0.5, if we're using subtraction, they simply don't accumulate enough PP to stay in the top 25. With division, though, it's more about ratios, and in Liberty's case, while they don't have good wins, their wins are comparatively much more good than their loss is bad, so they would stick around pretty close behind Oregon. There are other less extreme examples of this. One is the 2022 season's playoff. My rankings don't have TCU making the 4-team playoff. It's between Penn State and Tennessee. They're neck and neck. Penn State has a slightly better ratio, but Tennessee has slightly higher certainty. So if we use division, it's Penn State, and if we use subtraction, it's Tennessee. Now, I mentioned a value of 0.5 earlier because it's a logical middle ground. It's really hard to pick a value because it's not reasonable to adjust it until the teams you like start doing better. You actually can track how teams do relative to each other, since PP is essentially a polynomial function, by graphing the curves and seeing what values of x put one team above the other. In reality, my instinct was to set it closer to what we originally had, maybe 0.8 or 0.9, but for the sake of showcasing the effect, I'll stick with 0.5, and I want to know what you guys think. I'll show the rankings based on that in a moment. One of the other interesting metrics we can make with this is strength of schedule. It's not as meaningful as you might think since our rankings take strength of schedule into account already, but it is an interesting thing to look at. For each team, we can calculate how many playoff points they would have if they had won all of their games. Here's a look at the strength of schedule rankings. There are a couple things to note about using this uncertainty factor. For one, since I explained we don't double count matchups, it can actually end up giving an advantage to certain teams. Here's an example. When Michigan and Ohio State played, they had both already beaten Penn State directly. So when Michigan won, it didn't get any benefit from the fact that Ohio State beat Penn State. That makes sense, but it means that Michigan could have gotten a lot more points if, instead of Penn State, they beat a team of a similar or even a lesser caliber that was less connected to Michigan's other opponents. For example, Oklahoma. The more spread out your opponents are, the more benefit you get, even if they're not necessarily better. Essentially, this means that teams that play fewer conference games have an advantage, which gives an advantage to teams in the SEC and the ACC playing 8 conference games over teams in the Big 12, Big 10, and Pac 12 playing 9, for example. Notre Dame benefits greatly, only playing 5 conference games, and the other independents are boosted even more. Every independent team is featured in the top 25 strength of schedule. As our value of x decreases, this effect increases. I'm okay with this to an extent, but it's hard to know how much is too much. And also, as the value approaches 0, the difference between opponents' difficulty becomes smaller. Like I discussed in my last video with ranked wins, teams are often praised more for playing against, say, 2 top 15 opponents instead of maybe 8 moderately difficult opponents, but this ranking is more granular and holistic. With all that said, here are the final rankings of the 2023 season with a value of 0.5. It's always difficult to evaluate the rankings. This one is certainly much more similar to the final AP rankings, but as we've discussed, that's not always a good thing. I'd love to know your thoughts. Is 0.5 too low? Is subtracting playoff points better than dividing them? Are these rankings even any better than what we had at the start of the video? Did I miss anything? Regardless of the oddities we see, I think they can all be justified by the numbers, and unlike the rankings we see currently in college football, any one ranking is at least consistent in its own criteria, avoiding the inherent favoritism and oversimplifications that committees and voters often suffer from. In short, I have great faith in this system, with perhaps only a few details to be ironed out. Thank you.